Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our second Pathways to Decarbonization workshop. The team's energized to bring this next conversation to our community, and we're really glad you're here. I'm Jeremy Bowers, Director of Environmental and Regulatory Affairs and the Strategic Initiative Manager for Pathways to Decarbonization. I want to acknowledge on the call with us today from the OPPD Board of Directors, Director Craig Moody, Director Eric Williams, and Director Mary Spurgeon, as well as our initiative sponsor, Mary Fisher, our Vice President of Energy Production and Nuclear Decommissioning, along with several other members of our senior management team. Thank you all for being here. It's no secret this has been a busy day here at OPPD. I also want to say thank you to any other elected officials and community leaders we have on the call with us today. Thank you all again for being here and your support of this work. As I said last time, this is a district-wide effort. And in fact, as we discussed tonight, it's a community effort. So I want to take also this opportunity to thank those working hard to make the workshop happen and continuing this work, focusing on our mission of affordable, reliable, and environmentally sensitive energy services. You'll be hearing shortly again from Colton Kennedy, our project manager for the Decarbonization Energy Portfolio Project, as well as our vendor partner E3. I also want to take a moment here at the beginning of today's session to introduce Ryan Stiggy. Ryan's accepted the role of Strategic Initiative Manager for this initiative, and when it becomes effective on May 16th, he's going to be able to give a full-time focus to further development and coordination of the broader decarbonization program. Ryan's been with the district for roughly 8 years and recently in a lead engineering role. So thank you, Ryan, for stepping up into that. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I'm excited to join the team and be part of the amazing work that they're doing.
Very good. And thank you all of you who forwarded the invitation and worked with us to bring others in our community to the conversation this evening. I know many of you, re-forwarded things out and tried to mobilize folks to be here, and that's important to us. We received some great feedback from the first workshop, and we'll get into that as we get started. But before we do, let's get to the next slide. And as you know, we start each meeting here at OPPD with a safety moment. So we'll do that here now, focusing on the Nebraska 811 service. And at least for me, how thankful I am to have it warm enough to be talking about projects like this. But this is an opportunity we take to highlight an important aspect of electrical safety. So the main message here, before you dig, call this free service, locate and mark underground utility lines. Also, and more immediate to our work tonight, please be aware of your surroundings as you watch this presentation, especially considering this is a 2-hour engagement. I encourage you to get up, stretch your legs, but be aware of your surroundings as you do it. As I mentioned, we wanted to begin with feedback from the first workshop. So on the next slide, I guess I'll start by saying if you weren't able to join us for the first workshop, I do want to let you know, remind you, I suppose, that these are progressive in nature. This is the second of 6. So I'd encourage you to go back and watch the recording of the first workshop. You can see that's found at oppdcommunityconnect.com. It's also a good spot to point out here that we are again recording this session. So please be aware of that as we get to opportunity for questions, comments later on. And if you have a friend not able to join us this afternoon, despite your best efforts to get them here, we know there are folks that are really interested that aren't able to join us. So if you have a friend like that or a colleague like that, please encourage them to get on and watch the session as well. The team was really gratified that, as you see here, most attendees at the first workshop were generally satisfied with the approach here. We certainly don't confuse that satisfaction with the workshop as satisfaction with other business decisions or perhaps methods or that everything crystal clear yet. But we were glad to see, though, that the attendees did appreciate the platform and the approach that OPPD is taking with this community conversation and the design of the workshops. So you see some of the feedback we received here, though, to make the workshops even better. We're glad able to start incorporating that here with the second workshop. As I said, this is one of 6. The first bullet here focuses on tools for questions and discussions, and we'll ask you, and Jamie will mention this as we get into some of the new tools that we plan to use tonight, to really focus your questions on just clarifying questions, throughout the presentation, because we're really excited to get to a point of the conversation where we can open it up to more broad questions. But we'd like to use that tool to make sure that the information, that the conversation, that there's clarity around the topic that we're presenting. I'll point out the comments here on multiple monitors. You may notice the presenter or other panelists looking in multiple directions. We're really just trying to keep up with comments and feedback in real time. So if you see the presenter or other panelists are not looking directly at the camera, that's likely the reason. So I wanted to point that out. We also got some feedback reminding us of the need to continually provide context on where tonight's conversation fits with the rest of this broad decarbonization work. So Colton's going to spend some time on that in the beginning as well, which will really allow us to focus in on this multi-sector modeling and its impact on OPPD's planning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. She's going to talk about some of the tools we'll be using this afternoon and a few of the more pragmatic items about our time together. Jamie.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a reminder to all OPPD and E3 staff to mute microphones when not speaking, and a reminder, if it helps, to unmute when it's your turn. Please silence all your electronic devices. As Jeremy stated, this meeting is being recorded, so keep that in mind, and if you need to go back or want to refer to someone, it's at OPPD Community Connect following this. Public attendees on WebEx are in listen-only mode. But you do have opportunity to participate. So when it's time, we're going to take comments and questions via the following channels. When prompted, and we'll have one of these in just another slide, we're going to ask you for some feedback via Poll Everywhere. And I'll give you some instructions on that. It's super simple. You can do it via your cell phone or on another screen on your computer. Go to a quick site or text, and you can engage with us as we prompt you with these Poll Everywhere questions. It's super snazzy, and we hope that you'll participate with that so we can engage with you in that way. We also want to hear from you if you have clarifying questions, as Jeremy also mentioned, via the WebEx Q&A feature. The graphic to the right of this bullet point kind of shows that up. I have a colleague, Sarah Lake, who is going to help monitor those, and she might pipe in here and there to let our speakers know that there's a question that is relevant to the topic at hand. That's what we want you to use the Q&A feature for. When we've got that content that sparked a question, you want to clarify for it, and probably everyone would benefit from it, please use the Q&A feature for that. Just imagine, if you will, we're all in a room together in person like we'd rather be. That's when you would ask those questions. There's maybe some content that isn't relevant to what the guys are talking about, and we've got an option for that later on. So please keep that in mind. Q&A, stuff that they're talking about right now. The raise hand feature is going to be utilized when we can really open it up for conversation in this workshop format. And my other colleague, Kimberly Barnes, is going to acknowledge when you have your hand raised. We'll have a little bit more instruction when we get to that point. You can do it whether you're on the WebEx by clicking a little hand icon, or even via the phone if you weren't able to join us online, but you'll have options for that as well. So keep that stuff in mind as we hope to get your engagement from the session. All right, and I think I'm going to start it off with one of our Poll Everywhere questions. So you've got some instructions there. When the poll is active, and I'll activate it in just a second, you can go to pollev.com/OPPD1, or grab your phone like you're going to text someone and type in 22333 where the phone number would go. And when the actual subject, the body of your text, type in OPPD1. And I'm going to flip over to that screen. Flipping. All right, and so let me make sure I've got it activated. Okay, so did you attend or watch after the fact workshop number 1, Pathways and Planning? Getting some responses in there. Flip back here. I want to see how many responses. I know it's going to block it for me, isn't it? All right, so we've got actually some repeat attendees, fellas. That's good stuff. All right, and then I think I go straight to another question, don't I? Let's go. In the spirit of the subject matter here, give us some feedback. Do you have an all-electric home, or do you drive an electric vehicle? You've got the option for either, both, or neither of those. Just curious who we've got in our audience. Oh, check it out. Look at both. All right. All right. And now I'll turn it back over to you, Colton. I think I'm going to let you talk about the agenda.
Thanks, Jamie. Good to see that we have repeat attendees, so I won't cover too much of what we already covered in the last workshop. Our intent and our objective today is to share, discuss, and gather feedback on the results of the multi-sector modeling that we've done and the impacts of that multi-sector modeling on our future planning scenarios. So you're about to see some pretty interesting results, I guess to the tune of that second question that you had on what OPPD's load could look like if we have more things like electric vehicles and building electrification. So the first half of the workshop, or actually not the first half, I'm going to try to get through this rather quickly here, but for the first part, I'll spend contextualizing this workshop and this project relative to the other projects within our decarbonization program, and this workshop relative to the other workshops that we have in our series. I'll also go over sort of a glossary of terms to be able to prepare you as we get into the technical work that our partner E3 is going to present today, and that's on the results of the multi-sector modeling, where we'll cover the approach, some of the scenarios that we're considering in that modeling, and then what's to come and how it impacts the rest of our work. We'll also be discussing the next steps and where you can engage on the project. So as a reminder, the energy portfolio project is to study actionable pathways to eliminate or significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from OPPD's energy portfolio while balancing impacts on reliability, resilience, and affordability. A couple of things that I want to point out in this project charter or this description is that it is a study, and so it's it's not a specific set of decisions that we're making. It's a study, and we're going to be evaluating a range of different pathways. So not just a single pathway, but we're going to come up really with what a conservative pathway looks like, what an aggressive pathway looks like, what a moderate pathway looks like as we reduce our carbon intensity to ultimately meet the goal of net zero carbon in the future. Next slide. And so the energy portfolio project is just one of the 4 projects that we have under our decarbonization program. I'm going to briefly talk about the other projects to orient you, and so if you have additional questions that are focused on those topics, you can engage on those specifically. So the first of our 4 projects is the internal operations project, and this is a project really that's in mid-course, but we've used to identify and account for OPPD's existing greenhouse gas emissions. And then the second part of it is to focus on ways that we can reduce our non-generation emissions. So this would be things like OPPD's own supply chain and fleet and business practices, things outside of our energy portfolio. The second project I want to talk about is our customer project. And so in the last workshop that we had, there were actually quite a few questions and comments around very specific projects or products, offerings, demand response products, and offerings for customers. And so that initiative or that project is going to focus more on the specifics of what we're doing to enable customers to be able to decarbonize their own emissions and also work sort of collectively in a collaborative way that helps the utility achieve the overall goal of decarbonization. Today's focus, that third project, is the energy portfolio, and really today we're going to focus on the impacts of electrification. This is sort of an understanding that broader decarbonization of the economy has significant impacts on the electric utility, and we want to incorporate that directly into our planning as a range of potential futures. In this project, we're optimizing the supply and demand and storage resources to meet the overall objective of decarbonization, while also maintaining sufficient resources for the system in a reliable and resilient way, and minimizing the cost and financial impact to customers. So that's really the focus of this project and the details that we're going to get into today and the rest of the workshop series. And lastly, there's the community project. And so this is a project that we have that's focusing on how we can leverage our learnings from this project, or from the energy portfolio project, but the other decarbonization work that we have, into advocating and partnering with the community to achieve smart decarbonization in a broader sense, as we move towards that objective. So hopefully that context of this project is useful. You can learn more about each of these projects at OPPD's communityconnect.com website. So for the energy portfolio, we have a series of 6 workshops. Today is the second workshop. The first workshop, we provided an overview of the overall project, the modeling approach at a very high level, and the timeline. You can watch a recording of that to be able to orient yourself better around the work that we're doing. That was really at the IEP2 level of inform. Here's what we're doing on the project. Today, we're going to try to enhance that a little bit and moving to an inform and consult level of IEP2 engagement. We do have quite a bit of technical work done today, and so you'll get to see those results, and we're also going to be able to hear if there are concerns or significant recommendations that you have on some of those. I do want to set the context that this is just one of the many assumptions that's going to go into our modeling, and there are many opportunities for engagement and involvement as we see that level of IEP2 engagement increase to the involved level for workshops 3 and 4, and as we look towards what we can do with the results in the initial results and the final results. The next workshop that we're going to have, workshop number 3, is going to be focused on key assumptions and scenarios. So that's one that you really want to be at. We're going to be talking about what types of technologies we're considering, whether that's solar or storage or wind, long duration storage, carbon capture, advanced nuclear technologies. That's where that conversation is going to happen, as far as including the performance and cost forecasts for those going out into the future. And in that workshop, we'll also be talking about the different scenarios or constraints that we have for how aggressive or conservative the overall pathways might be to achieve the objective. So again, it's really, again, this is a study to inform the district and to inform the utility on what the potential outcomes could be, and so that'll be a range. Workshop number 4, May 26th, will be focused on the details of the modeling approach, so how we use those key assumptions, what we're considering, how we're considering reliability, resource adequacy, resiliency, how we're considering the financial impact, sort of the details of the things that we're evaluating and how the information is being assembled and aggregated. And then there will be a little bit of a break between workshop 4 and 5 as the team is conducting the work and the technical optimization and ensuring high quality results. And so as we look towards Q3 and Q4, after that deep modeling effort, we'll share the initial results, be able to collect feedback on those, and if there are concerns or questions, we'll be able to address those and modify the results if needed before we get to the final results in workshop number 6. And also, just as a check here, and we presented a little bit more detail on this in the last workshop, but the results that we have out of these pathways will ultimately inform our integrated resource plan filing in February of 2022. And so you can look for the commonalities of the pathways to be informing that plan in that filing to the Western Area Power Administration. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about IEP2. That's the International Association for Public Participation. And so that's what OPPD is focusing on, or a standard or framework to be able to engage the public. Really, we've put a lot of effort into this work and this planning to be able to be proactive and get early feedback as we're going through the process, even before the process. And so you're going to continue to see us focusing on the level of engagement to the extent that we can. I already shared a little bit of the objective for today. The outcome is really to seek alignment and confirm understanding of the potential impact of broader decarbonization on the electric utility and how that affects our planning. So before we get into the E3 content and the technical workshop, I do want to provide a little bit of overall context and the reason we're doing this deep study on the multi-sector modeling. So really, when we talk about decarbonization, it's been a global discussion, and that global discussion is around the entire economy. And so there's a lot of focus on the electric utility and the emissions of electric utilities, but really, the greenhouse gas emissions and specifically carbon dioxide come from burning of fossil fuels and energy consumption, and that doesn't just happen through electricity today. And so we understand that low carbon or net zero carbon electricity is vital to economy-wide decarbonization. It enables and supports that goal. But as we look at other sectors decarbonizing, we know that has impacts on the electric utility. As a few examples, electrification of transportation, so electric vehicles, electrification of building heating and ventilation, air conditioning, has significant load impacts to a utility, electrification of cooking and sort of other processes. All of those things impact the overall demand for electricity on the utility, also the shape of electricity, so when it's used and how much it's used, but also it does impact the criticality of the electric system really to support society. So as individuals, as a community, as we rely more and more on electricity, there becomes an increasing need for that to be reliable and resilient, since we're using it for transportation, since we're using it to keep warm in the winter. There's many other aspects. And so we do want to make sure that aspect of reliable, resilient power follows through this entire analysis, but is going to get some very specific attention. And we know that is key to being able to accomplish the overall goal. I do want to mention also sort of a relative size. And so when we're looking at this, we're considering things that are at the customer level, but also we're considering that grid level. And really a lot of the focus of supporting many of these different end uses is at the grid level. And so you're going to see a lot of focus on that primarily in the energy portfolio project. It doesn't mean that there's not ways to accomplish it at a more distributed scale. And so we have other projects within the decarbonization program that'll focus more specifically on that as well. And we'll also be talking about some of the assumptions that we have regarding utility scale and distributed energy as we get into the next workshop, which is key assumptions and scenarios. So definitely please join us for that discussion. So we have a question. Go ahead, Jamie.
Well, thanks. So as Colton mentioned, low carbon electricity is vital to economy-wide decarbonization. There's another opportunity for your input. I'm going to switch over, but if you didn't join in any of the previous couple questions, you still have an opportunity. You can engage in any one of these. How can economy-wide decarbonization impact the electric system? Got 4 choices here. It can increase the total demand on the electric system. It can change when and how electricity is used. It can increase dependence on the reliability of electric supply, and all of the above. So far, we're unanimous.
I think these are really easy questions that we put together, Jamie. But I know that there's more than one response there. At least I'm hoping.
Yeah.
So it's a good understanding check, if nothing else. So I'm really glad to see folks understand the context of why we're looking at multi-sector modeling and how that supports the broader work. I think if we just went on the decarbonization analysis without considering what the rest of the economy looked like, we could be missing some significant dynamics that may occur between now and 2050. So again, glad to see all of the above response there.
Got some smart folks on the phone or online.
Well, easy questions. And smart folks. So I'm sorry. So before we get into E3's content, I do want to provide a couple of terms here that we're going to use and you're going to hear again and again. The first is electrification. Defined this last time, but really it's the conversion of non-electric energy consumption to use electricity. So when we talk about non-electric energy consumption, people use energy in their daily lives. They use it for a lot of different things. They use it, gasoline in their vehicles, diesel in their tractors, natural gas in their homes to heat. And so we're talking about converting that form of energy consumption to electricity. Peak demand, you'll hear that as well. This is the highest amount of energy that's demanded on the electric system, and it's also the level that the system must be sized to and designed for to handle. So that is a very critical component as we go through planning, and certainly that'll come up in future workshops. Low or net zero carbon fuels. So as an example of those, because we're going to be talking about those, hydrogen, renewable natural gas, biofuels, there's many more. I think nuclear could be considered a low carbon fuel or net zero carbon, well, low carbon fuel with offsets. It really depends on sort of how you're counting the whole stream. But there's, don't consider this as a full exhaustive list. But those are fuels that either are generated with clean electricity or generated in a way that absorb carbon dioxide during their production. So things like renewable natural gas and biofuels do emit carbon dioxide when they're actually consumed, but the process of production captures the carbon, and so on a net basis, they're low or net zero. Negative emissions technologies, so we're going to be talking about that a bit. Those would be technologies that are used to capture or sequester carbon dioxide, so take it from the environment, from the atmosphere, and permanently remove it, or remove it in the long term. And one example of a negative emission technology that we'll be talking about, and this is a future technology, but something that may become available in the planning horizon to 2050, is this direct air capture. And that's, again, a type of negative emission technology that's able to take it straight from the air and capture it. So hopefully those terms are useful as we go through the technical workshop and some of the details. And with that, I just want to do a check. Jamie, are there any questions that we have that I can address prior to getting into the workshop content?
Sarah, anything you want to bring up yet?
No, I think we've been trying to stay on all the Q&As that have come through. There is one, though, that we haven't had a chance to get to yet, and this is a good time to clarify this. We have a question that asked if there is a chat channel or just the Q&A. And Jamie, did you want to clarify again, like all the different ways that we're going to be communicating with all of our attendees?
Happy to. Yeah, we wanted to expand the options for engagement, but also not overcomplicate things. So the Q&A is for those questions that are relevant to the content being covered. As I said, if we were in a room and Jeremy, Colton, or Zach were speaking, you would kind of raise your hand and be like, hey, can you clarify this? The Q&A in WebEx is meant for that. The poll everywhere is just kind of routine engagement as we go throughout. And then at the end of this, as in a workshop format, what we would really like is to have some open conversation with you. And that's when we use that hand raise feature that Kim will help us with. And you'll be able to actually verbalize your question. We'll call on you, make sure you're unmuted, those things. And you can do that via WebEx or via the phone. And that's going to be those that maybe aren't relevant to what content the guys are covering right now, but you still want to expound upon it and have a dialogue about it. So hopefully that clarifies things a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Jamie.
All right.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Zach Ming at E3. We've been working very heavily with their team in the detailed analysis and planning. They bring together some great talent and some great tools. The OPPD team has been very heavily involved throughout the entire process, but E3 just does that much better job at presenting it. So they're going to go ahead and share the content, and we'll address any questions that you have.
All right, thank you, Colton, and nice to be with everyone today. We're excited to share some of our initial findings from one of this first phases of work. So again, like Colton said, my name is Zach Ming. I'm going to do the bulk of the presenting today, but we have a number of E3 colleagues that are on the line as well, and they might just be jumping in. They'll definitely be here to answer questions. So if you do have any clarifying questions as we go along, please feel free to add that in the Q&A. Some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is on the relatively technical side, so we'll do our best to make sure that we're explaining everything clearly, but if there's any clarifying questions, please just feel free to jump in and the team will make sure that we get those addressed. So if we go to the next slide, as we introduced in the first workshop, this broader energy portfolio project is comprised of several different tasks. You can see all of those tasks listed here. Today's presentation is focused on the multi-sector modeling task and some of the results that we've found from this. So the multi-sector modeling task really focuses on this idea that OPPD has a very clear goal of net zero carbon by 2050. The other emitting sectors of the economy, transportation, buildings, et cetera, it's a little more uncertain whether those sectors are going to decarbonize in the same way that OPPD is decarbonizing, at what pace they might decarbonize, and if they do decarbonize, what types of strategies might they use? As Colton said, one of the primary strategies for decarbonizing other sectors is electrification. And if those sectors electrify, that could increase electricity demand that OPPD would need to serve quite significantly. So really the primary goal of this entire multi-sector modeling analysis is to develop a range of electricity demands that OPPD might need to meet in the future. Kind of thinking about this dual challenge in front of OPPD. Number one, how to decarbonize the electricity supply, but number two, how to meet a potentially significantly increased demand for electricity by 2050 or sooner. So again, primary focus here is focused on electricity demand, forecasting, and scenario analysis. But I think broadly, this multi-sector modeling may be useful in other aspects of OPPD programs, thinking about how might OPPD be able to create programs to facilitate decarbonization in these other sectors, or what types of community engagement opportunities might there be. So I think this report, today's presentation and ultimately the final report that we'll be publishing should be a nice sort of base of information that OPPD can draw on and leverage in future avenues. So if we go to the next slide, we keep saying multi-sector analysis. Well, what are all of these multiple sectors that we're talking about? Well, they're all listed here. So we have disaggregated the entire economy into 5 different emitting sectors. And you can see here the sectors we're analyzing are the transportation sector, the building sector, which is comprised of residential homes and commercial buildings, the industrial sector, which is a very diverse sector that has factories, chemical plants, food processing plants, cement production facilities, a whole host of really different things are included in this industrial bucket. And then, of course, the electricity sector, which will be the focus of our entire energy portfolio project, and then the agricultural sector. Today's presentation is really focused on the first 3 sectors, transportation, buildings, and industry, and what the key decarbonization opportunities or strategies might be for those first 3 sectors. There are different options for decarbonizing the transportation sector. Transportation could decarbonize through electric vehicles, or it could decarbonize through continuing to use some type of liquid fuel in cars, internal combustion cars like they are today, but a more decarbonized fuel like something that comes from biofuels. And so we're going to be looking at what the potential decarbonization of those first three sectors might look like. We'll be getting into in later workshops, and that's really the focus of this entire project in the electricity sector later on, thinking about what the options are to decarbonize electricity. So, there's lots of different strategies to decarbonize electricity, whether it's renewable energy, nuclear power, energy efficiency, or all of the above. We'll be getting into all of those options in later on workshops, so that's really not the focus of today. And then finally, this last sector here, agriculture. A lot of agricultural emissions come from just use of the land, or not really associated with energy use. And so to the extent that there are greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector that are not associated with energy, those are outside the scope of our study. To the extent that there are emissions associated with agriculture like tractors, that would be captured under the transportation sector. So we have some agricultural emissions in this analysis, but not comprehensively all emissions associated with non-energy factors like land use. So we're looking at all of these sectors, what the opportunities to decarbonize these sectors are, and we have different strategies for each sector that are unique to each sector. This final bucket that you see here at the bottom, what we call negative emission technologies, are an emerging set of technologies that can remove carbon from the air, as Colton mentioned, and this technology is not really associated with any specific sector. It can be used to remove carbon from the air and offset any remaining emissions in any sector to the extent that they're still there. So we will be talking about negative emission technologies as a strategy to get to net zero, even if we don't get to absolute zero in every single one of these different sectors we're analyzing.
Zach, before we continue here, we had a question on defining carbon capture and sequestration for those that may not be familiar with it. So if you could provide just a quick overview of what carbon capture and sequestration is. And then I think there's another question that's related to carbon capture and sequestration, and it's really around, I think, the cost or financial value of being able to sequester carbon, whether that can be bought or sold, and what the value is. I think that question is something that we'll handle more in the next workshop as we get into the key assumptions and scenarios, really the key assumptions around those negative emission technologies, and then probably the modeling approach, workshop number 4 as well. But the first question there was around defining carbon capture and sequestration, if we can.
Yeah. So carbon capture and sequestration is really just a technology that's kind of an add-on to existing fossil fuel plants. So it's taking a coal plant or taking a natural gas plant and continuing to use coal or natural gas in that plant. But then instead of allowing the carbon dioxide to just go up the smokestack and into the atmosphere, you actually capture the carbon dioxide before it can go into the atmosphere, and then you need some place to put it. So that's the sequestering aspect of it, and really the most feasible place to put it in really large quantities without it somehow escaping into the atmosphere is to store it underground. So carbon capture and sequestration is really just capturing the carbon before it goes into the atmosphere and storing it underground. And, I would say that the primary reason why that might be an appealing strategy is if it's cheaper to do that. If it's cheaper to continue to use natural gas but capture the carbon instead of doing something like just not using the natural gas power plant and using renewable energy instead. So it's an economic trade-off in thinking about how that option trades off with other decarbonization options in the electricity sector.
Thanks, Zach.
All right. So I think if we go to the next slide.
All right, we have opportunity for your input once again. So grab your phone, go to pollev.com, whichever you prefer. We're going to go to the next question. Which area of non-electric decarbonization do you see the most potential in? Definitely a front runner, but got some varied responses.
So this is an interesting question, Jamie, because we're going to see the results here shortly, right? For the study that we've done. So I think it's good to understand kind of what the initial thought is as we go into this. Looks like the predominant answer is transportation, but we also have some buildings, industry, and agriculture there as well. So good understanding check to start with.
All right. So we have an overview here at a pretty high level of the technical analytical approach that we use to conduct this analysis and create all of these results. We are going to be publishing a full report on all of the assumptions and technical approach that we took for this analysis. So we're not going to get into all of those details today. Today, I just want to mention broadly that we used a model that E3 has developed called the E3 Pathways model. By happenstance, it just happens to be called Pathways and is not related to the Pathways to Decarbonization work that we're doing here. But this is a model that we've used to conduct similar analyses, multi-sector analyses for jurisdictions across North America, like California, New York, different states in the Midwest. And the E3 Pathways model is really an economy-wide greenhouse gas planning model. It looks at what the energy demands are across the entire economy, what the population is, how many homes that population is going to need, how many cars and how many miles those cars are going to need to drive to serve all the transportation needs of the population, really all the different sectors of the economy. It looks at what the demands are, and then it tracks the infrastructure that's required to meet those energy demands. And the infrastructure, there's options for whether that's gasoline-powered vehicles or electric vehicles, and we can play around with different assumptions to create scenarios that achieve different greenhouse gas mitigation targets. So that's what we've done here. We've analyzed and looked into a number of different scenarios using this model, ensuring that we both meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets that we've set out for ourselves in the different scenarios, as well as making sure, very importantly, that all of the energy demands of the economy are met, making sure that we have enough heat in homes, enough electricity in buildings, enough vehicles on the road, et cetera. So if we go to the next slide, just to kind of cut to the chase and give in advance some of the high-level results and takeaways from this analysis, I think what we see when we look at the OPPD, or really the Omaha service territory, thinking about multi-sector decarbonization, is we find a lot of similar trends as we've seen in other jurisdictions. And we can kind of summarize and lump those together across the 4 pillars of decarbonization that you see listed here on the left. The first pillar being a strong focus on energy efficiency, the second pillar being emphasis on electrification, the third pillar being low carbon electricity, which allows electrification to actually result in emission reductions, and then the fourth pillar being low carbon fuels, which allows decarbonization for those sectors that are very difficult or expensive to electrify. And focusing on OPPD specifically, we do see significant growth in electricity demand for OPPD through 2050. In one of our primary cases we'll be discussing today, electricity demand could grow approximately 2.5x, or 2.5 times what currently electricity demand is for OPPD. So that is, I mean, it's hard to overstate really how significant that is and how much of a challenge that's going to be to build all of that infrastructure, both generation, transmission, distribution, to make sure that OPPD can reliably and cleanly meet all of those demands. And that electricity demand increase in electricity demand is due a little bit to just general trends like growing economy, growing population, but it's primarily due to the electrification of transportation and buildings. So the growth of electric vehicles and the growth of electric heat pumps in buildings. And it's that growth in electricity coupled with the emission reduction targets that OPPD has set out for itself that become a linchpin for the decarbonization of those other sectors, the transportation and the building sector. Electricity has a really strong role in economy-wide decarbonization, but there are certain uses of energy that are very difficult or expensive to electrify. And so for those sectors, low carbon fuels like biogas and hydrogen will also play a key role. And we'll be talking about the role that those resources might play. And finally, just the final key takeaway in conclusion is that this is a big problem. All of the sectors are going to have to be involved in decarbonizing the economy, and OPPD really does have a key role in that, in both enabling significant growth in electricity while reducing carbon emissions along the way.
Zach, before we proceed, we had a question on the modeling approach previously, and that's, do climate change models drive GHG emission reduction targets that are part of OPPD's model? So I think this probably gets to the relationship between load and weather, and I would think whether climate change weather is impacting the modeling that we have. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess I would say broadly, the emission reduction targets are just an input. They're an assumption that we're deciding. So we decide that the emission target is going to be net zero by 2050, or something higher than net zero by 2050, and then we gradually ramp down over time. So that's an assumption that we're making to try to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Now, we know that climate change is happening, and there are going to be impacts of climate change on the energy sector in terms of how much, if it gets hotter, there's more air conditioners use electricity, that increases electricity load. So there are some feedbacks there. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. So that is something we will be looking at when we get into the more detailed electricity sector analysis. So I think it's important, but we really don't have a whole lot of assumptions about exactly how climate change impacts energy demands in the analysis that we're presenting today. Okay. So if we go to the next slide, we have a number of different scenarios that we've analyzed, thinking about how these other sectors of the economy might evolve between now and 2050. So just before we get into that, to level set about what the different sectors look like today and what emissions in those sectors look like today, you can see here, this pie chart here in the middle of the slide shows greenhouse gas emissions by sector in the Omaha area today. So you can see a little more than half of total emissions today are from the electricity sector. That's the darker blue wedge and the lighter blue wedge. Not all of those electricity emissions are due to OPPD. The broader Omaha area is an exporter of electricity, so some of those emissions are really incurred on behalf of electricity loads that are outside the OPPD service territory, and so that's what the non-OPPD electricity is referring to there. And then you can see other sectors of the economy, transportation and industry have relatively significant quantities of emissions, and then as well as the residential and commercial building sector there. So the units here are in million metric tons or MMT of carbon dioxide. And in our reference scenario, which you can see here on the right, this is a baseline scenario to sort of level set what might be happening in all of the other sectors. We assume that OPPD achieves its goal of net zero carbon by 2050, but that there aren't really any significant changes in all of the other non-electricity sectors. So the OPPD electricity, which are the blue wedges, go from about 50% of emissions to zero, and all the other sectors of the economy don't really have any reductions, greenhouse gas reductions between now and 2050. So transportation, industry, and buildings just continue on as they are today and comprise the bulk of emissions in 2050. So again, this is not saying that this is not a forecast, this is just a reference scenario with which we can compare all of our other scenarios to. So if we...
Zach, I have a clarifying point.
Yeah.
And on the previous slide, we talk about the different sectors. We talk about transportation, industrial, commercial, residential. And so just for the audience, there's a lot more energy consumption by some of those sectors. That's electricity, right? And so this is showing the emissions that are non-electricity. But some of those types of some of that type of energy consumption is across different fuels. So like transportation, that would include aviation fuels. It would include transportation fuel, regular gasoline, petrol fuels. But that is all fuels that have sort of been designated as transportation fuels across types. So hopefully that's helpful to some of the questions that we had. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Colton. So this slide right here lays out the 5 different scenarios that we analyzed. We already talked about the reference scenario. That's the first row in gray here that you see in this table. And again, our reference scenario assumes that OPPD achieves its goal of net zero, but doesn't really assume any action in any of the other sectors of the economy. So even though there's no reductions in any of the other sectors of the economy, because OPPD and electricity is about 50% of emissions today, this scenario still achieves 50% economy-wide emission reductions, which is all due to reductions in the electricity sector. And again, this is just a reference scenario. Another scenario we examined, we call the moderate decarbonization scenario. That's the second row here. In this scenario, we also assume OPPD achieves net zero carbon reductions, but that there are moderate levels of decarbonization in the other sectors. And so on the whole, this scenario achieves about 60% reductions of carbon emissions across the entire economy. And then we have 3 different scenarios that are different flavors of net zero economy-wide scenarios. So the bottom 3 scenarios here all achieve net zero carbon emissions across all sectors of the economy: electricity and transportation and buildings and industry. And the reason that we have 3 different variations of this scenario is because we think that, OPPD pursuing net zero carbon really is consistent with a broad push across the entire economy to pursue net zero carbon. Carbon emissions are a global problem. They're not limited to one jurisdiction or one industry. And so really for OPPD's impact to make a lot of change, then it's going to have to be mimicked in other sectors of the economy and other geographies across the world. With that said, if the broader economy does decarbonize and get to net zero emissions, there are a lot of different ways in which it could do that. And so we've tried to look at some of the different key impacts on OPPD if the broader economy decarbonizes through different mechanisms. So one of the strategies that the economy could use to decarbonize is a really heavy emphasis on electrification, very heavy emphasis on electric vehicles and electric heat pumps in buildings. And we have created a scenario called the net zero high electrification scenario that looks at that. We also have on the other end of the spectrum, low bookend, we have what we call the net zero high fuel scenario, which assumes that there's some levels of electrification just because we know that electric vehicles are taking off to a certain extent. But this scenario continues to rely relatively significantly on liquid and gaseous fuels, continues to rely relatively significantly on the natural gas pipeline system, but instead of flowing natural gas through the natural gas pipeline system, it flows decarbonized fuels through that system. So things like hydrogen or biogas or synthetic gas that don't have the carbon associated with it that standard natural gas does. So that is an overview of the scenarios we will be talking about today. I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay, looks like we're looking for your input again. We're going to go over to Poll Everywhere. Of those scenarios, which one do you think is most likely to occur? Let us know. Pretty
And I
tight
guess
race.
while we're waiting for these responses to come in, I didn't explicitly discuss the balance scenario, but suffice it to say the balance scenario relies on a combination of electrification and decarbonized fuels as well.
Hey, Jamie, can you tell how many people are voting? We had a question in the Q&A, just curiosity.
We had 23 results there, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you to everyone who's participating.
All right, so if we go on to the next slide, go to the next, yeah, there we go. So this slide here provides a really high-level overview of the 5 different scenarios that we introduced, both what the emission reductions look like in each of those scenarios, as well as the impact on electricity demand for OPPD for each of those scenarios. So you can see here this chart on the left looks at economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions between today, 2021, and 2050. You can see our reference case, which is the blue line there on top. Emissions in the reference case decline by about 50%. Again, this is purely due to our assumption that OPPD achieves its target of net zero, but there aren't really any emission reductions in any of the other sectors of the economy. So that achieves about 50% emission reductions. The moderate decarbonization scenario assumes some moderate levels of decarbonization in the other sectors that are non-OPPD. And then we have 3 different net zero scenarios you can see listed here, the high fuels, the balanced, and the high electrification case. And those all achieve significantly more levels of direct carbon emission reduction. However, as is very clear, none of the net zero cases actually completely eliminate carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction. And the reason for that is because there are some parts of the sectors that are extremely difficult or costly to directly decarbonize. And so we are assuming that those remaining emissions would need to be offset through negative emission technologies. And we have some information on negative emission technologies later on. Colton's discussed direct air capture, but we assume that it's more economic to use a negative emission technology by pulling carbon dioxide out of the air to offset these emissions than to try and directly eliminate those emissions.
Zach, I think we had a question earlier about some examples of really hard to decarbonize areas. And I think we're going to get into that as we talk about some of the specific sectors, but I would just provide an example. Aviation would be one that requires quite a bit of, high energy density. And I think there are ways to electrify it. It just becomes more challenging and more costly. And another example I would provide is high temperature industrial applications that really, it's hard to produce that high of temperature without some amount of fuel burning. So are there any other examples, Zach, or maybe we'll just get into those as we talk about the specific results as well?
Yeah, I think those are excellent examples. And I think the other important thing to talk about is for aviation. It's very difficult to create an electric plane because the weight of a battery is so large and a plane has to, directly impacted by that weight. So a plane really needs to continue to rely on liquid fuels. And we can create zero carbon liquid fuels through things like algae. But there is, particularly for biofuels, biogas, and other zero carbon fuels, there are limited supplies of those fuels. Oftentimes biofuels are created through things like landfill gas or wastewater treatment. There are only so many wastewater facilities, there are only so many landfills. And so once we've used up those sources, we have to go on to other sources to get those zero carbon fuels. So there's increasing levels of cost because there's limited supplies of those. And so at some point, it may become more economic to, instead of continuing to go to the next most expensive zero carbon fuel and the next most expensive zero carbon fuel, just to say, I'm going to continue to use diesel and offset those emissions through negative emission technology.
Thanks for that. And we'll get into some of the details of some of those hard areas too as we look at the sectors. So that'll be upcoming.
Yeah. Okay, so this chart on the right here is one of the key results of this entire analysis, which is really what does electricity demand for OPPD look like under each of these scenarios. So you can see, again, we have our 5 scenarios here. For about the first 5 years or so through 2025, all the scenarios are relatively similar, but there is a lot of electricity demand growth in those first 5 years. That's primarily due to industrial load growth and assumptions that OPPD currently has regarding that sector. And then from about 2025 onward, that's where the different scenarios start to diverge depending upon our assumption of how much electrification is included in these sectors. So in our reference scenario, which doesn't really assume any changes to the other sectors, there's not significant quantities of electrification. The electricity demand is actually relatively constant from 2025 onward. And then on the other extreme, we can see this purple line on top, the high electrification case. Electrification is the key decarbonization strategy in this scenario, and so that results in significant growth of electricity demand. And then you can see here this net zero balanced case, the red line, that is the case that we mentioned earlier that was referenced to electricity demand increasing by about 2.5 times what electricity demand is today. So you can see electricity demand grows here from about 10,000 gigawatt hours per year to over 25,000 gigawatt hours per year. So quite a large range of potential future electricity demands, but I think one of the key stories here is that electricity demand is going up. Even in the reference case, electricity demand is significantly higher, and in the net zero cases, electricity demand is even higher than that. So one of the key takeaways from this part of the analysis. So this slide, the previous slide was really focusing on annual electricity demand across the entire year. That's what that chart on the right was showing with all of those lines. But one of the key challenges for any electric utility is not just meeting electricity demand across the entire year, but being able to meet electricity demand in every hour of the year. And the most challenging hour of the year is the peak hour, where instantaneous electricity demand is highest across the entire year. So today, the peak demand for OPPD is about 2.5 gigawatts. If you look at this chart here on the left, this is the net zero high fuels case. We can see what peak demand is by season. So we have it broken down between summer and winter for 3 different snapshot years, 2021, 2030, and 2050. And we can see for this net zero high fuels case, how winter and summer peak demand change due to load growth. And today, again, load growth or peak demand is in the summer, and it's about at a level of 2.5 gigawatts. and that would grow in the high fuels case to about 4 gigawatts by 2050. And in this scenario, OPPD would still remain a summer peaking system. Again, the summer peak being primarily driven by air conditioning. If we go all the way over to our other bookend case, the net zero high electrification case on the right, again, peak loads in 2021 are the same because that's today. So it's a 2.5 gigawatt peak summer system. But in the high electrification case, one of the key decarbonization strategies in this scenario is the electrification of building heat, converting from natural gas furnaces to electric heat pumps. And what that means is that there becomes a lot of new electricity demand during very cold times of year. And that electricity demand during extremely cold times, where heat pumps are very inefficient, puts an extremely large demand for electricity on the OPPD system. And so because of that, in this scenario, OPPD would actually become a winter peaking system due to all of the heating load that it would need to serve in the winter. And the peak load would actually jump to about 7.3 gigawatts in an extreme polar vortex type of situation, which you can see here on the far right chart in this winter bar. So in 2050, in a polar vortex extreme 1 in 40 year type of black swan event, peak demand would be about 7.3 gigawatts. And that's higher than what it would be in an average year. In an average year, it would be 6.5 gigawatts, still a winter peaking system. So there are clearly significant peak demand challenges associated with the complete electrification of building heat. And so that is why we have developed this balanced scenario in the middle, which uses a combination of electric heat pumps and natural gas furnaces that can provide backup heat during extremely cold days of the year. And so what this balanced scenario does here in the middle is when the temperature is cold but not frostbite temperatures, it uses electricity to provide heat. And then during your extreme cold days where it's like 0 degrees or below, it uses a backup natural gas system. And so this balanced scenario here that you see here in the middle, OPPD would remain a summer peaking system. Peak loads would grow to about 5 gigawatts per year by 2050 due to a combination of industrial load growth and electrification. And this balanced scenario is really the scenario that we think is the most promising of this trio of net zero scenarios. And it's the scenario that we're going to be focusing on most for the rest of the presentation and diving into some of the details and assumptions on this scenario. So just to kind of reiterate, the reason why we think the balanced scenario is the most promising scenario is because it avoids some of the extreme peak loads of the high electrification scenario that you see here on the right. It avoids, the large costs and upgrades that would be required to the OPPD system to meet those extreme peak loads. But it also relies on electricity when it can and avoids some of the costly zero carbon fuels that are required in the high fuels case. So the high fuels case relies on a significant quantity of zero carbon gaseous fuels. And there's, as we've mentioned, only the supply of those fuels is limited. And as you get further and further up the supply stack, those fuels become more and more expensive. And so this is a relatively expensive case, the high fuels case. And the balanced case kind of provides the best of both worlds. It allows relatively cheap electricity to be used when it's available, but when the demand for electricity becomes impractical or infeasible, then it does have some level of zero carbon fuels that can be used to back up the system. So if we go to the next slide, we've kind of already talked about this. This is probably the most technical slide in the entire presentation, so I'll try to get through this relatively quickly. This is just explaining in a little more detail why the peak load is so high when you only rely on an electric heat pump to provide all of the heat for a building and don't have any type of backup natural gas furnace. So heat electricity is provided through technology called an electric heat pump. And you can see a sort of icon schematic of what an electric heat pump is here on the left. It's essentially a device that uses electricity to pump heat from outside the home to inside the home. And when it's mildly cold outside, this is actually an extremely efficient way to heat a home. It's about 3 to 4 times more efficient than just using a natural gas furnace. The problem with this is that when it gets extremely cold outside, 0 degrees or lower, there's really not much heat to speak of outside the home for the heat pump to pump into the home. And so it kicks the heat pump into an overdrive mode that uses a lot of electricity. It's called the resistance heat mode, and just increases electricity demand significantly. And you can see here, this chart in the middle looks at the electricity consumption of a heat pump based on what temperature it is outside. So you can see that as the temperature gets lower and lower, once the temperature gets to about 5 degrees and below, the electricity demand in kilowatts of the heat pump just increases exponentially and goes straight up like a hockey stick. And so these are the types of situations that we would be hoping to avoid under the balanced case. The balanced case would use the electric heat pump when it's 40 degrees, 30 degrees, 20 degrees, which is still cold and still requires a lot of heat. But the electricity demand of the heat pump is relatively reasonable. And then in the balanced scenario, when the temperature gets to 0 degrees or lower, then the heat pump would turn off and the natural gas furnace would come on as backup and avoid the strain on the electricity grid of these super high electricity demands. I will skip over this chart on the right, but if you want to peruse that at your own leisure, feel free to do so. It kind of looks at what electricity demands across the different seasons look like in some of our different scenarios, both today and in 2050.
Hey, Zach, we have a question, and I think this is good.
Yeah.
It's around, we're talking specifically here around air source heat pumps, but ground source heat pumps don't need that backup form of resistive heat. I think we talked about that in the modeling, and some of the challenges are retrofitting existing homes with ground source heat pumps versus much easier to do for new build construction. And we have assumptions on both air source and ground source heat pumps, but we understand that those ground source heat pumps don't have the same peak winter impact because they're able to operate much more efficiently. So wanted to provide that commentary for ground source heat pumps.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Ground source heat pumps are great because the ground is warm even if it's super cold outside, but ground source heat pumps are just a lot more expensive because you have to dig a huge hole. And it's really costly when you're trying to retrofit an existing home with that. If you're building a new home, it's not, you're doing a bunch of stuff anyway, so it's easier to just build the ground source heat pump, but it's actually much cheaper to rely on sort of the balanced scenario of the hybrid gas furnace and heat pump that we have for existing homes.
So I guess a comment or a plea maybe to the folks on the call. We've shared with you one of the more technical challenges that we have in decarbonization and the impacts to the electric grid around this peak heat scenario. Specifically, peak heat is something that's unique to a really cold climate. It's different than some other jurisdictions encounter. And so it's going to take some unique and innovative approaches to being able to solve it. What we're doing here is if you have any ideas, we'd definitely like to hear about those ideas, and if we can incorporate those into the modeling. Just know that this is one of the, we can overbuild the system, we can create a very large system, but there's probably smarter ways to do it. And so if you have thoughts around impacting that and helping out with that peak heat scenario, we'd definitely love to hear your thoughts at oppdcommunityconnect.com. And Zach, there's also a comment around the balance scenario, and I'll read it. Does describing the balance scenario as most promising equate to describing it as the easiest or cheapest? And I think we're going to get into a little bit of that, but if you kind of before we get into the balance scenario results, if you contextualize it relative to those other two on the spectrum.
Yeah. So I think what we mean by most promising is ultimately we are trying to come up with a range of electricity demands that we're going to be studying in more detail for what OPPD will need to meet to achieve net zero carbon. So we want to make sure that we're looking at a realistic range of electricity demands, and we can't analyze, 1,000 different scenarios. So we think, when we say most promising for balanced, we think it is, there's a lot of uncertainty around costs. And so I don't want to, put a stake in the ground that it is the lowest cost scenario. Obviously, there's uncertainty, but we think it is one of the more reasonable scenarios because it simultaneously avoids some of the extreme costs associated with pure high electrification or pure high fuels. So ultimately, it really is an economic decision when we say most promising. Yeah. All right. So, like I said, we will be primarily discussing the net zero balance scenario in a little bit more detail. So let's dive right into that scenario. You can see here some of the detailed results for what the emissions look like in each sector for the balance scenario. So this chart on the top right here shows each of the different sectors. We have the electric sector in blue and light blue on top. We have the transportation sector in red. We have the industrial sector in tan. And then we have the commercial and residential building sector. Again, that's just the non-electricity part of building use, like natural gas heating. We have the commercial and residential building sectors on bottom in green and blue. And you can see that we're making assumptions about cost-effective decarbonization strategies in each of these sectors and how those strategies might be able to reduce carbon emissions. So we assume the electricity sector goes to zero, and we assume significant reductions in transportation, industry, and buildings. But we do not assume that we're able to completely eliminate carbon reductions in transportation and, in particular, industry. And we assume that the way this scenario would achieve net zero carbon emissions, as is defined by the net zero balance, that we would rely on negative emission technologies, or NETs, which is this gray wedge below the zero line here. And we'll be getting into on each of the subsequent slides what the key assumptions are for each of these scenarios and what is reducing the carbon emissions in those scenarios. And we're going to be focusing on today the red transportation wedge, the tan industry wedge, and then the green and blue building sector wedge here. We will not be focusing on electricity today because that's going to be the focus of the rest of our energy portfolio project. Once we think about what electricity demands are, then we'll look at what all the different strategies for decarbonizing the electricity sector are. So we're just going to be focusing today on transportation, industry, and then commercial and residential buildings. So if we go to the next slide, we can see here a little bit of a deep dive on the transportation sector. So we've pulled 3 of the largest subsectors of transportation out on this slide. We've pulled out the light duty vehicle subsector, medium duty vehicles, and heavy duty vehicles. So light duty vehicles are typical passenger vehicles like cars. Medium duty vehicles are something like pickup trucks, slightly larger vehicles that have towing capability, et cetera. And then heavy duty vehicles are your big, tractor trailers that haul large amounts of goods around. And if we just kind of focus in on the light duty vehicles, just this chart on the left here, you can see some of our assumptions for how this subsector of transportation is evolving between now and 2050. So today, almost all light-duty vehicles or passenger vehicles are gasoline-powered cars. And that's that gray wedge there in the middle. Almost all cars are gasoline-powered cars. And we assume that by 2050, almost all of those gasoline-powered cars have been replaced with either battery electric vehicles, which is the blue wedge, or by hybrid plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which is the green wedge. And a plug-in hybrid is really just a car that has both a battery that can, have limited range, but also some backup gasoline engine. And one of the interesting things about this scenario is that even though it takes until 2050 to almost fully replace all of the gasoline cars in the economy, actually by 2035, we are assuming that 100% of new sales will be battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. But even if you reach 100% of new sales by 2035, it actually takes until close to 2050 to completely eliminate all gasoline-powered cars from the fleet because they still exist. And you kind of have to wait for those cars to reach the end of their useful life before they can then be replaced. Someone goes back to the dealership to buy a new car and then they purchase a battery electric vehicle, for example. So that's what's happening on the passenger, the light-duty passenger side of the equation. You can see the medium-duty vehicles and the heavy-duty vehicles. We do assume some electrification of those types of vehicles. So again, the blue wedge here in each of these two right-hand charts are the quantity of battery electric vehicles. But there are a lot of vehicles that we do assume continue to be powered purely by liquid fuels, primarily diesel, which is the red in both of these right-hand charts. And this really is an assumption based on economics. But electrifying a vehicle that's very large, that hauls around significant amounts of weight, towing a lot of weight, requires really large batteries, which can be very costly. And so in some circumstances, it might not be very economic to fully electrify trucks or certain types of trucks, and it might be more economic to continue to rely on diesel and use decarbonized diesel like renewable diesel or biodiesel where you can. But to the extent that there's limited amounts of that, then you would use standard diesel in some trucks and then just count that as an emission, and then you'd need to offset that emission through something like a negative emission technology. So that is our assumption of what's happening in the transportation sector.
Zach,
yeah.
We have a comment or a question here, and it's around housing and transportation. I'm going to read it, but I think we can respond to the transportation component and get to the housing a little bit as well. Do the longer-term projections for electrification assume housing and transportation use continue on existing trajectories? For example, same portion of vehicle miles traveled in cars, but electric, or do they anticipate shifts in public transport, more dense urban housing, and less population percent in large exurban homes, etc.? So I think there's a question about the vehicle miles traveled, and I think we do have some assumptions around declining vehicle miles traveled on a per individual basis, but growing overall as the population grows. I don't know if you want to talk specifically around some of the assumptions there. We'd welcome it. And then also, I think the same thing with housing. As the population grows, we're still assuming that people need homes.
Yeah. No, those are great questions, and we will have all of those assumptions documented in our final report. But yeah, there's really two competing factors here. There's the fact that the population is growing, and we assume that the energy service demand increases as the population grows. So more population, all else equal, means more cars, more vehicle miles traveled, more homes. But to a certain extent, we also have assumptions around energy efficiency and energy conservation. So we assume that cars do become lighter and become more efficient and require less energy to travel a certain mile. We do make some assumptions around, just smarter cities and public transportation that may be able to reduce the quantity of vehicle miles traveled per capita in the population. And so to a certain extent, those are offsetting each other, but you can see here, overall, there's still an increase in the amount of vehicles that we're assuming, which is primarily, again, due to population growth.
Thanks, Zach. And I think also there's probably an assumption around the housing as far as size of housing. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, as far as the overall housing and building sector.
Yeah, I would have to check on exactly what our assumptions are for type of housing. I would say we are making pretty aggressive assumptions on the energy use of houses, particularly regarding assumptions like insulation. And so we assume that new houses have really good insulation and help keep energy demand down, and that existing homes may be retrofitted to increase the amount of insulation to reduce energy demand as well. So there are a lot of assumptions on energy efficiency, which again is one of the 4 pillars of decarbonization that help reduce the total cost of these net zero scenarios. So if we go into the building sector a little bit in more detail, we can see here where most of the emissions come from in the building sector. Today, most of the emissions in the building sector are from natural gas furnaces. You can see in this chart here on the left that the natural gas furnaces provide most of the heat in buildings, and we assume, and that's the brown wedge you can see, and we assume by 2050, pure natural gas furnaces are mostly entirely phased out of the economy and are replaced with this green wedge here, which is a hybrid natural gas furnace coupled with an electric heat pump. And again, as we've discussed, the way that this sort of combination of technologies would work is that it would use the electric air source heat pump when it's cold outside, but not frigidly cold. And then it would use the natural gas furnace as a backup system when it got to be super chilled degrees outside. And then Colton mentioned earlier as well, ground source heat pumps, which don't suffer from the same sort of peak heat challenges that air source heat pumps suffer from. But again, those are most economic on new construction homes. And so we have a small wedge of assumption of ground source heat pumps. You can see that's that sort of light blue that's increasing through 2050 there on the bottom. That's our assumption of ground source heat pumps and how they might be able to contribute to building heating needs. And again, this chart on the right, I will leave you to look at the details of this if you want to dig into that. But the moral of the story is that we think the balanced scenario is the most economic scenario for building heat because it avoids the high peak heat, peak capacity challenges of only relying on electricity, but it also avoids the challenges of only relying on zero carbon fuels, which are limited in nature and become very expensive when you need to use a lot of them. So the balanced scenario, to a certain extent, has the best of both worlds and we think is the most economic option. The last sector that we'll go into details on is the industrial sector. And the industrial sector is an interesting sector because it is incredibly diverse in terms of the types of energy uses that are included in the industrial sector. It's a little bit harder to just have a catchphrase or a tagline for what the industrial sector decarbonization strategy is, in the same way that you can just say, electric vehicles for transportation. There are too many different diverse uses of energy in the industrial sector, whether you're talking about factories that need electricity or boilers or processing plants, refineries, cement production plants. All of these types of different industrial uses require different types of energy. And we've tried to identify decarbonization strategies for some of those different industrial subsectors. So we do assume electrification of some types of boilers and when low temperature heat is required. We do assume hydrogen for some types of process heating where that's feasible. And then we do assume carbon capture and storage, also known as carbon capture and sequestration sometimes, for some types of process emissions. And what that refers to is, the production of cement. It's not really an energy process, but the production of cement just inherently releases carbon dioxide into the air. And so one option would be to capture that carbon dioxide as you're producing the cement, the same way you could capture it from a natural gas power plant and take that and store it underground. And that would be a way to reduce the carbon intensity of that particular slice of the industrial sector. But the broader story here is that there's a lot of diversity in the industrial sector. Some applications are feasible and cost-effective and relatively easy to decarbonize. Others are much more difficult and much more expensive. So we do assume that there are some subsectors of industry that are very difficult to decarbonize. And so this sector does not completely eliminate its emissions, and we would need to offset any remaining industrial sector emissions using negative emission technologies.
Can I just jump in for just one quick second?
Yeah.
We're just getting a lot of comments through the question and answer, and I just want to really clarify that we are having an open session at the end where you'll be able to ask any sort of questions or provide us any sort of comments. We really, really, really want to address only clarifying questions right now through the Q&A. And if you could please just be mindful of that and gracious to us if we've missed a question from you and we haven't responded yet. It's just because we're kind of getting inundated with a lot of questions, and we're just trying to make sure that we're answering as much as possible to those clarifying questions. So just wanted to note that there will be time at the end for comments and additional questions and answers.
Thanks, Sarah, for that. And I do have one comment as well before we jump into this. It's around total costs. And so just for clarity, our costs that we're evaluating are total. They include capital costs and not just the ongoing operating costs of the technologies that we're evaluating. So just for clarity, I think that was an example of a good clarifying question that we received. Thank you to the individual who asked that.
Thanks. So speaking of costs, we do have some high-level cost results for the net zero balanced scenario. And I will just preface this by saying that costs are highly uncertain, and there's a lot of assumptions that go into what the cost of these different technologies are going to be, especially thinking all the way out through 2050, what the cost of fuels are going to be, whether it's natural gas or gasoline or diesel, what the cost of those fuels might be in 2050. But we have put together some high-level cost estimates. Here we presented for the balanced scenario. In the net zero balance scenario, there's really three categories of cost increases. The first is increased capital costs, because this scenario requires more expensive vehicles, more expensive homes that have more insulation. So there's a little bit higher capital costs. There's higher electric sector costs because this scenario has a significant amount of electrification that puts higher demand on the electricity system, requires more resources and more infrastructure. And again, the final category of cost increase recognizes the fact that this scenario is actually not able to completely eliminate carbon emissions. And so the only way to actually achieve net zero is to use a negative emission technology. And here we assume that negative emission technology is something called direct air capture, or DAC. That's that tan wedge you see here on the top of the chart. And that would be an additional cost that would need to be employed later on in this scenario to achieve net zero. But the flip side is that there are actually some cost savings associated with the net zero scenario, primarily associated with fuel. So this scenario uses a lot less natural gas and gasoline and diesel than even a reference case. And so those all provide cost savings to the economy. And the net result of that is by 2050, the net zero balance scenario costs about $1 billion more per year than the reference case. And so $1 billion is never a small amount of money to sniff at. But if you do put that in a little bit of context, that's about 2% of Omaha GDP. So these numbers and values and percentages are always in the eye of the beholder, but I think we would reasonably characterize 2% as a reasonable cost increase, something that's not going to break the bank. So if we go to the next slide, and this is the last slide that I have to present before we pass it back over to OPPD and then open it up for Q&A. Again, to kind of bring it back to the primary objective of this multi-sector analysis, really what we're trying to get at is come up with a reasonable bookend of electricity sector demands that OPPD might need to plan for in thinking about how to achieve net zero carbon. It's sort of the dual challenge of how do you reduce carbon emissions and how do you enable decarbonization of the broader economy, which might involve a lot of electrification, which would increase electric loads. So we need to some extent, narrow down on our scenarios of what we're going to analyze as we move into the reliability analysis and ultimately the portfolio optimization, where we look at electricity sector portfolios. We need to know what demand scenarios, electricity demand scenarios we're planning for. And so our initial proposal here is to analyze two cases, the reference case, which you can see here in blue on bottom, and then the net zero balanced case, which you can see here in red. And our plan or proposal would be to develop portfolios, electricity sector portfolios for each of those electricity demand scenarios in thinking about what types of investments in infrastructure OPPD would need to make in each of those cases. So that is something that I think we're definitely open to stakeholder feedback on, in addition to anything else that stakeholders might have comments on. And we'll be definitely, I know this is a complicated topic, so we don't need to hear every comment today, although definitely open to a discussion, but feel free to submit any comments particularly related to this on oppdcommunityconnect.com. So with that, pass it back over to Colton and the team.
Thanks, Zach. And we do want to get the public pulse on this, but we think that this workshop and the work that we're doing here with the multi-sector modeling is important. As we set up the overall modeling for the energy portfolio, but we really would like to see the value that the audience is seeing in this as well.
As Colton said, we obviously think it's valuable. We would like your input. How valuable do you believe multi-sector modeling is as part of OPPD's decarbonization planning?
Did we just have DEFCON 10? What the fuck happened?
Well, it's good to see that folks value the work that we're doing and the time that we're spending on this stage of the process. So good to see and glad that everyone who's on this call is participating in this discussion. So thank you. We'll have time for open Q&A and raising your hand as we go forward. But first, I wanted to mention what we have upcoming in the next workshop. So today's workshop was really focused around the multi-sector modeling. It was focused around the load that comes from other sectors of the economy as the overall economy-wide goal to decarbonize moves forward. The next workshop, which is May 12th, 4 to 6 p.m. for stakeholders, will focus on the details of the technologies, specific technologies, types of technologies, the cost trajectory of those technologies that are being considered in our modeling, and also the types of scenarios that we're considering. So I mentioned up front, but really this is a study, and it's a study over a range of pathways. And so those pathways are going to vary in terms of speed of implementation and total carbon reduction over that time period. They're all going to meet the goal of net zero carbon by 2050. It's just a matter of how that looks. And so we definitely value, I know there were a lot of Q&A questions that we received that were very focused on specific technologies today and in the last workshop as well. So hopefully we get really good attendance there, and you'll be able to have your questions addressed. And of course, the modeling approach is where we'll get into some of the details of exactly how we're modeling reliability, resiliency, and the economics of the portfolio. So that's where we see a lot of the assumptions that we're making meshing together. So please join us for that workshop.
Okay, so we got some next steps for you. As we've said before, and we'll say repeatedly, we are committed to continued stakeholder engagement and feedback, offering opportunities throughout these workshops and beyond. You will get a post-meeting survey, just as you did last time, as we know we have a lot of repeat attendees. So there'll be a pop-up when you leave the WebEx. So make sure you click through. It is a safe link to click through to that. And then watch your email. There is also a thank you email that comes via WebEx. It'll have a link for that survey. If for some reason you miss it or don't have time to do it right away, we really would love your input. There are the two upcoming workshops that Colton just mentioned that are already scheduled on May 12th and 26th, workshops 3 and 4, again from 4 to 6 p.m. We asked your feedback in previous surveys about days and times and things like that, and we took the collaborative feedback, and we're sticking with Wednesdays in the late afternoons. We want to hear your feedback on OPPD Community Connect. That's where we're housing the recordings and we're posting updates, and we've got different tools and widgets to prompt your feedback and comments, and we would love to hear from you there. Feedback will be accepted for 1 week following when this recording is posted for those who feel like they want to say something that they don't get an opportunity to today, or those that get to catch the recording and still want to have their voice heard. If your comment involves things like PDFs and links, just email us at outreach@oppd.com, and we can take your feedback that way. And then we've also got our speakers bureau still for when you'd like to hear more, or you've got a group that you think would benefit from us speaking to this subject. We've got a lot of subject matter experts to do a fantastic job, if I do say so, in sharing that information. So just let us know via Speakers Bureau if you would like to have someone come talk. All right, so this is the public comment portion. This is what we were talking about, and we appreciate, as Sarah said, we appreciate your grace in allowing us to try to keep the questions pertinent to the subject at hand. And we know that there will still be some here, but we want to hear from you with regard to anything that you have, so we can let you know if it's going to be forthcoming or we can address it right now. Again, if it's a workshop, so please let your voice be heard. If you want to raise your hand, click the participant icon to open the attendee list, and you'll see the little hand raise feature there. You can scroll to the bottom and click that raise hand button, and then when you're done, if you'll just lower your hand so we know that you've been taken care of. We'll try to get through as many of these questions as we possibly can, and we'll try to get through everyone's questions. So if one person has a ton, forgive us, we might have to jump around so that we can get everyone a chance to speak. And then the telephone users, if we do have any phone users, you can use *3 to raise and lower your hand when you're done. And that allows us to identify you based on some of the digits of your phone number. So rest assured that your full phone number is not available, but we can identify you with a couple of those characteristics. And my colleague Kim will be calling on people accordingly. So we do know that there were some questions that have already been referenced, but we'll go ahead and get started and see if we do have some raised hands, or if Colton, you want to kick us off with a couple?
Yeah, Jamie, before we pivot to some of those raised hands, and maybe while individuals are raising their hands, we've tried really hard, I've tried really hard to keep up with the Q&A, and there's a lot of them going past the screen. And so I have a couple that I want to follow up on while folks are thinking about their questions. Specifically, there's one around industrial load growth. So there's a distinct change in slope in industrial load growth at 2025 that indicates either a significant drop in growth or an increase in efficiency. What's assumed in 2025 that causes the sudden improvement in industrial efficiency? So I just wanted to make a general comment, and I think we tried to articulate it early on with some of the notes on the graphs. But we're taking our near-term forecast, and our near-term forecast is an aggregation of the information that we have in our area of many different customers. And so the Omaha area, in the near term, we're seeing good economic growth, and I think we're seeing an indication in that. In the long term, you can really see the impacts and the increased load really as a result of decarbonization and electrification. So hopefully that answers some of the question there. It's a composition of our near-term forecast and what we know, and some long-term trends. And I think the near term we're seeing healthy growth. So hopefully that addresses the question on that one. And then there was another comment around impacts on the natural gas system. And for the audience, our focus right now in this work is first really to see what the range of impacts are going to be on load for the electric system. And so this is starting a conversation that we expect to be much broader and to be inclusive. And so I think all of those things will come with time, and there will be plenty of time between now and the future as we identify the best path forward for the community. So hopefully that addresses that. Our main focus is on sort of what the range of electric load looks like, and what the potential shape is today.
Kim, do you have any raised hands that you want to call on to see if they want to go ahead and verbalize their question?
Hey, Jamie, this is Brent. I don't see any raised hands at the moment, but if folks want to feel free to go ahead and do that, you can open up the participants list and you'll see that hand raise button there in the lower corner.
Thanks, Brent.
Looks like we do have one for Mr. Dr. Corbin.
You hear me? Yes?
We can hear you, sir.
Yes.
All right. I'm just wondering, I realize that OPPD serves more than just the city of Omaha, but the city of Omaha is not exactly high rated by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy for our building energy efficiency. And I'm just wondering how that fits into the model of on how much energy you're going to use in the future and how you're going to get to net zero.
Thank you, Dr. Corbin. If I could respond to that, we have assumptions for energy efficiency. I think as Zach said, they're relatively aggressive. We see that as necessary and a cost-effective way for decarbonization. There are other efforts, the customer effort that's focused more specifically on products and offerings in the near term to be able to help reach decarbonization goals. And then we have our community project, which is really where we're learning how we can advocate for that across the community, whether that be in building codes or however that is to be able to improve that. So the specific assumptions around energy efficiency and what we're including for the electric portfolio design is going to come up in the next workshop number 3. So you can join us there for a little bit more detail on that. And I would say broadly, you've seen the results. There's a very large range of electric load, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so, there's a lot to be figured out as we move forward. So hopefully that answers your question, Dr. Corbin. Thank you.
Do we have another? We may have tackled them all during the session, fellas.
There is a question in the chat 549 for the OPPD staff that are keeping track of which questions that we're answering around the energy cost and its impacts to customers, and how that might look on rates and to specific types of customers. So one is the costs that we've shown today are economy-wide, and the work that we're doing in the electric portfolio will really focus on the electric sector costs. We've made some high-level assumptions to try to get the total costs, but the future work that we're going to do on this project will get a better idea of the electric system, and I think how that turns out over time for rates is really dependent on a detailed analysis. And the impact, and really it's a matter of impact to customers' bills and their total costs across fuel sources. I think one of the interesting things is customers may save in one area and spend more in another area as energy transitions from one source to another. So I think a lot of that is unknown, uncertain, and to be determined, and we'll do the best that we can as we move forward in this analysis.
We can give it a final pass for hand raises while Sarah and team look at any other Q&As. Brent, do you see anyone out there?
Hand raised from Mr. Welsh.
Go ahead, Mr. Welsh.
Yes. I have a question about, you talked a little bit, especially here at the end, but I think earlier too, about how you are working sort of system-wide or community-wide. And I'm wondering, are you or will you talk with MUD and other gas suppliers in your service territory to coordinate everyone's efforts to reach net zero by 2050? Because if only OPPD is doing this, it's not going to be good enough. Of course, 2050 is way too late anyway, but I'm just wondering what coordination is being done with other carbon emitters.
So, Jeremy, I'll catch one part of that, and I'll let you answer the broader question. I think the last part that I wanted to address is 2050, and we're evaluating a range of scenarios. So I think you'll see scenarios that are more conservative and things that are more aggressive than you'll see things that are more aggressive than the 2050 timeline, and there's different ways that we can reach it. So we'll talk about that in the next workshop, the scenarios workshop. But Jeremy, I'd turn it over to you for the broader question
thanks.
on community engagement.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll just say, as Colton said, the focus, one of the pieces of value of this multi-sector work is characterizing the electric load, and that's the main input into the next phase. But we want to maximize the value of the information that we've discovered here, and the way that information is articulated, and as much as that's useful, we absolutely plan on reaching out and on having conversations, not just, you mentioned MUD, but with other potential stakeholders that this information could be useful to them. And there's other efforts that other organizations have in mind that are they're pursuing. And so far that we can be partners in that is absolutely our goal as public power. That's one of the reasons we're doing this today, is to help facilitate that conversation. I know we have folks from a variety of stakeholders here on the line. So your point is well made, that it's not just OPPD, and that's why we're looking at it in these broad 4 work streams. So appreciate the question.
Okay. Brent, Sarah, anything we need to yet address?
Do you see another hand raised from Mr. McGill?
Hi there. The data from today has been great. I'm just wondering if
Mr. McGill, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I think we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. Have you speak up a little bit, or maybe into the mic?
How do I sound now? How about now?
Yeah. It's a little distorted, sir. That's all.
Okay. The data from today has been great. I really enjoyed some of those graphs. I took a lot of notes about some specific numbers. I'm just wondering if it's possible to get a PDF of some of those, on the understanding that none of that's final. I mean, the only time it'll be quote unquote final is when the final report comes out, but it would be very informative to get some of that hands-on now.
Yeah, so we'll be providing the presentation today, and we'll providing there's a little bit of a technical appendix and some of the details as well. So we'll provide you what we have prepared. We'll post it after the workshop with the recording, and then there will be more information to follow as we go through the project. So
great, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Brent, what do you got now?
We do have a hand raised from Mr. Vavolka.
Okay.
Hello, this is Alan Vavolka. I just had one question. Given that this modeling is extremely valuable, I'm under the impression that it's going to be maintained as an ongoing tool so that as time passes and some of the unknowns and assumptions become better known, that the model can be updated on a regular basis and be used going forward as a living document. Is there a plan to do that?
Yeah, so I think if I could take that one as well, I think the extent that we think that electrification is going to impact OPPD's load, I think is pretty certain. So I think in some way, shape, or form, we'll be monitoring the electricity use of those end sectors over time. I think as we look at the broader economy, I think and support these discussions that's probably yet to be determined, but some of the details of that will definitely be focusing on as it pertains to electric load.
All right, we're nearing the 6 o'clock hour, but I want to see if we have any other questions. Are there any other hand raises, Kim?
Yes, it looks like we have one more question, or maybe not one more, but Mr. Welsh has asked another question. I'll unmute him.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, in your scenarios, are you taking into account what I think OPPD should be doing to work with our Omaha City Council, Douglas County, and all the other counties and cities to raise energy efficiency of homes, and not just with new build efficiencies, but to retrofit homes, because that could reduce the amount of electricity required by OPPD if all of our old homes would be insulated better. That would reduce your peak use in the summertime. And I think that's a major concern of OPPD. And also at the national level, how hard are you going to work to get a carbon fee and dividend bill passed so that new innovations can happen more quickly that will help OPPD reach net zero by some date earlier than 2050? And I have to take exception to what somebody said earlier about carbon emissions, comparing conservative to aggressive. I think those two things are the same thing. Conserving is necessarily aggressive right now.
So Jeremy, I'll take the first stab again at this one and let you follow up maybe on some of the national policy or some of the community discussion. So in regards to the different scenarios that we're modeling, I think the intention is accelerated decarbonization efforts where you're seeing more declines sooner versus ones where you're seeing declines later. Those will be the types of sensitivities that really come up in the scenario modeling. So when we use conservative and moderate, really and accelerated. We're talking about the speed of implementation of decarbonization. So for clarity, you'll see the results I think that you're looking for, the scenarios that you're looking for in what we're producing, and we can probably be more clear on the nomenclature, but have patience with us. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly comment on. I know we keep mentioning the community project, but again, I'll pivot back to that and say that the goal in that is where can we do the most good, and that's one of the ones that's obviously rising to the top is how and where and in what avenue should we take to advocate for efficiencies of existing buildings. Is that in building? Someone asked in the chat about advocating for changes in building codes. Is that in building codes? Is that where OPPD's voice, and is that where we can do the most good with our efforts? And there's a lot of work to put that into a systematic way that we can address that on an ongoing basis. We're not ready to roll that out yet, but absolutely appreciate the thought. In regard to the overall national conversation, there's a lot going on in that space, and we continue to monitor that and not just monitor it, but find out what, trying to continue to discover how can we best drive this forward, and also how it's going to affect the utility and the immediacy and then in the long term. And so there's a lot going on in that. Our folks that are monitoring those policies, and we're talking here actively about how should the assumptions that we make in this modeling look going forward, considering a variety of future policy scenarios. And so it's a big complicated question. I prefer not to kind of give details on this specific piece of policy, but these things are certainly top of mind.
Jeremy, to add to that, this study is a starting point. This is where we're getting the information, where we're seeing what the cost of different pathways are, what the different types of technologies are required to accomplish the goal. The goal is still the same. So, it's not really a matter of what the goal is. I think we're collecting information at this point that facilitates that conversation. And so, we have quite a bit of work to do between now and the end of the year, but we expect, an informed direction, is where we want to be, and that requires the detail of some of the studies that we're conducting.
How are we looking, Kim? Have we addressed our questions, or are there more?
Well, I've got a couple of hand raises. Let's see, from Mr. Welsh and Mr. Vivolka, but I don't know if they're prior questions or not.
Mr. Vivolka, we can start with you. Have we addressed your question, or did you have another?
No, I just forgot to lower my hand. Thanks.
You bet. No problem at all. And Mr. Welsh?
Yes, I have one more. Well, I've got lots more, but I know time is cutting us all off. And I'm just curious, in this year that you're working in right now, does OPPD have a plan for or an expectation of how much carbon dioxide will not be emitted this year? Because early reductions are much better for the planet than later reductions. So I'd like to know if there's a plan to reduce carbon emissions this year, right now.
Yeah, I would say that we strive for enhancing the efficiency of all of our generating assets and to optimize them in the most effective way. We have near-term decisions around power with purpose and what we're doing to decarbonize or convert North Omaha 4 and 5 from coal to natural gas. And this is an industry where that sort of transition takes quite a bit of work and groundwork to lay. So there are definitely many individuals in the organization focused on supporting the work that enables that transition.
Okay, I think I'd like to, if any of you gentlemen have any closing thoughts, I think we'd like to just refer any other comments and feedback to OPPD Community Connect. Hopefully we've blazoned that into all of your brains by now. That's where we want to hear from you. Please do not hesitate to go there and give us your feedback and take a look at what we've listed. Colton, Jeremy, Zach, anything else?
I'd really like to thank everyone for the questions. We definitely got a lot of questions, some good ones. You know, if I'm focused over here on one screen and scrunching my eyes, it's because I'm trying to answer the questions effectively. So just know I appreciate them and look forward to seeing hopefully everyone in the next workshop that we have focusing on some of the key assumptions.
Yeah, just likewise, we appreciate the engagement and just the energy around this, right? You know, we know we don't have the answers to all of the questions yet, but it's really important for us to be out here and having this conversation. So thank you all for the engagement.
Have a good night, all.